We're going to turn our attention now to our next plenary speaker, Mr. Ralph Tabberer.
Our next keynote plenary speaker is new to the face of ISTEK ELT conferences, but he is no stranger to the world of international education. With over 30 years' experience, Mr. Tabberer has been an advocator and innovator for education and teaching programs throughout England. Currently residing and working in Dubai, Mr. Tabberer is Chief Education Officer at GEMS Mensa, with offices worldwide in London, New York, Singapore, Delhi, Riyadh, and Dubai. GEMS is an international education company that owns and operates high-performing, holistic, program-driven schools, offering consulting both in the public and the private sector. GEMS' vision is to be the world's leading provider of education, enriching the lives of millions of children in communities in which they live. Its core value is centered in preparing its students with the adequate skills and meaningful experiences that they can apply then to the real world in education and professional employment.
His work and efforts have not gone unnoticed. In 2009, he was awarded the Companion of Most Honourable Order of the Bath, as well as an honorary degree from the University of East London. His education, work experience, and development have all been centered in educational programs and skills. Now, with an MA in Economics, Social and Political Science, and a PGCE, Mr. Tabberer has been working to reface the education system and programs in international schools. Being a teacher in the 21st century does not look the same as it did 25 years ago or even 5 years ago. Education is constantly changing, refacing itself, restructuring, and continuing to grow. The development and implementation of technology, the demand for differentiated instruction, learning environments, these are just some of the factors affecting the current trends that we see today in education.
Today, Mr. Tabberer will be explaining the changes and trends in education on a global scale, which will influence us as teachers as we plan ahead, make change, and get with the times. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm ISTEK ELT conference welcome to our next keynote plenary speaker, Mr. Ralph Tabberer.
Thank you both for that introduction, and thank you for joining me on this Sunday morning. It's hard to follow such a talented start, and thank you, Steve, thank you, Jeremy, for uplifting us. And one of the things I really want to talk about today is what a wonderful time this is to be in education. There's so much going on at the moment in the world which is now labeled as education. And in fact, there's one word that really starts my presentation today, and that is education is now ubiquitous. It's everywhere. Everybody's claiming. Even if you go online now and you play games, I notice that the games makers say it's education, really. Everybody wants this fabulous natural resource, education. It's become even more important than oil, but it's everywhere. And I think to live in an age when education is so important and is also so rich in its diversity and its possibilities, I mean, that's a unique time for us. And it brings us together from very, very different international communities. Now, my history, my personal history, is actually that I worked almost all my life in the United Kingdom and in the education system there. And I worked in all sectors of it, as a teacher, as a researcher, as a teacher trainer, as an administrator. And it's actually 10 years ago that a Prime Minister, Tony Blair, asked me to take charge of the UK school system. And he said, we have a small budget for you, £34 billion, and we have 22,000 schools, and we'd like you to improve them. And it was a marvelous opportunity in my life, and I went about it for a few years working with some politicians who really did want to make a difference. And all the time, my work was sustained by a modern energy for education. And and I always realized education was everywhere. I retired from that job a few years ago, and I've been living now, as the introduction said, in the Middle East. And I've worked with GEMS, I still work with them. I also run my own businesses now. And the funny thing is, actually leaving the UK, and for about the last 4 or 5 years being in the Middle East, I had to unlearn everything I ever knew about education. Because if you just move, I'm sure you've had this in your lives, if you move from one place to another, you think you know a lot about how education works, but actually you find that some things do work and some things don't. And you have to remake yourself. And I've probably lost every idea I ever had about education and had to reconstruct it again. And I'm finding, of course, now, I don't do that every 5 years. I almost have to do it every 5 days and every 5 minutes. The world, the pace of the world has become so fast that we're constantly searching for meaning. And my talk, and as I travel, I try to talk about the trends I see in education, because I want to, get a conversation going about where we think this is heading. The conference title, Through Their Eyes, is a fantastic reminder to us. But this, as education becomes ubiquitous, and we all get more involved, and it is such an exciting age, of course the challenge isn't just for us to make sense of what's going on, but it's to help them to make sense of what's going on. And as we look at education and its prevalence, sometimes we're dealing with a question for young people. They're begging us to help them find things out about the world. Sometimes they're begging us to help them get on in the world, to prosper. Help me to get my qualifications, my route, my life. And sometimes they're asking us to help me make sense of all that's happening. And through this talk, I want to come back again and again and again to that third purpose of education. Education for me is always going to be about helping young people find things out. It's always going to be about helping young people to understand and to grasp things and to get on. But above all, it's got to be about helping them to make sense. And that's a rich education, a rich educational goal. It's a goal which means that we should run deep when we work with children. We shouldn't just work on the surface. I'm going to start, though, on the surface, because you need some evidence about how ubiquitous education is these days. And of course, I went to the best possible source for finding things out, and that is Google. And I typed in education. I just wondered how many hits I'd get. And it may have changed since 2 days ago when I updated this. And there we have 2.64 billion places I can go immediately just to find something out about education. 2.64 billion, that's pretty ubiquitous. I thought I'd try school and see what happened if I typed in that. Where would Google lead me? And I was very amused to find out actually there's even more hits for school than education, which seems to suggest to me that they're doing something in schools other than education. In fact, if you subtract the first one from it, they've got about 2 billion other things going on in schools. Actually, that's quite good. These are some of the biggest hits on the site. And I thought, well, let's have a look at some of the modern ideas or sectors of education. And I looked at how many hits would there be if you went on the net and you went looking for a tutor. There are 125 million places to start looking. Out there's a lot of people trying to sell their services. Because I thought we needed a reference point for this, just to see just how important we are compared to other things in the world, of course, I tried Lady Gaga, who comes in at 419 million, which is much less than education, much, much less than schools, slightly more than tutors. So gives you a sense of our importance in things. Testing it a little bit further, a couple of other examples. One is online education. Supposedly this great industry that's growing, and you can get over 3 billion hits. Do you know them all? Are you keeping up to date with all of what's possible? Of course not. And online qualifications. I thought, now this is really interesting. I wonder how easy it is to go these days and get your qualifications. I have a few that I've amassed. Some of them by hard work, some of them by gift. But there's 95 million places you can go and get an online qualification. So if you're short and your CV's looking light, you know where you can look tonight on the net. But all of these things from Google kind of remind us about how ubiquitous, how prevalent education is. We live in such an exciting age. Again, I mentioned about games makers who now tell us that their games are educational. I've noticed there's a great trend in all sorts of areas of life to claim education as the solution. I think this started with some of the economists in the financial crisis who reckon actually that the way out of the financial crisis is for countries to become knowledge economies. And they say the investment in education is a great thing to do. I noticed in the Millennium Goals, going back, 10, 15 years, the Millennium Goals were all about how the way out of poverty was to invest in education. And these days, it's really interesting. As I travel the world, I now talk to people about things like security. And I had the great pleasure of meeting the Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, the Crown Prince of the UAE. And he told me, well, his interest in education is very serious because he considers education to be his country's best security and defense policy, because it's only through combating the ignorance that he finds in some of the families where the children go and get involved in terror elsewhere. It's only through education that he thinks he has a way of getting to young people and actually persuading them that there are more important values. There is a world of tolerance to be lived. And I think it's great, as I say, that we live in this age where education is so important. And it's been true of my life, certainly, that our knowledge about education, our understanding of it, has increased manyfold. We now know a huge amount about how education works. Some of this we've known as teachers viscerally for a long time, but it's good now that the research is catching up and there are many great works to pull upon. Not just Ken Robinson, who invokes this passion for creativity in education, and rightly, I mean, a great career of exemplifying that himself. But there are other terrific people who we should read and we should know, because this is the source of our pedagogic knowledge, our psychological knowledge of children, and if we really are going to understand our business and we're going to understand the children and how to work with them in the future, I think these are bodies of work which we should know deeply. I could have mentioned probably 30 people, but I thought if I was going to do a reading list, I go around places now and then and say, have you read? Have you read? And these are some of the best that I've read, certainly in the last 10 years. John Hattie, a New Zealander who's a great researcher. He's now at the University of Melbourne in Australia. And he's written a book called Visible Learning. And you really should have a copy on your shelves because he's taken thousands of studies of student achievement. He's got in those studies millions of students who have been introduced to different educational programs and interventions. And he's looked at the studies and he's looked at the measurement of the effects of these programs on student achievement. And he's taken quite a narrow range of student achievement, as is the tendency in a lot of the research. They can only really measure what it's easy to measure. But out of those studies, he's looked at what's the impact of different things, of different programs, on how well students learn. And these meta-studies he's built up, have allowed him to distill the big effects in education and the small effects. And it's a work of great scholarship. And he's even created something which you ought to see, which is a visual device he uses called his barometer. And he shows on this barometer all of the effects of changes like introducing better early years education, or more focus on literacy and numeracy, or changing your school leader, or all of these different things. And he's looked at all of the studies in that area, and he's looked at the effect size. What if you change this? What's the normal studies say is the effect size? And he's unpicked the fact that almost everything on a scale from 0 to 1, almost anything you do to change your program usually will have a positive effect. And it will normally be in the range of from about 0 to 0.4 on his barometer. And so he says, well, things that are in that area I'm not terribly interested in, because really you can go on off and change anything and get that effect. The interesting effects are those which are 0.4 and above. And he brings out of the studies, for example, some uncomfortable findings. But good researchers should do that. They should be scientists. They should show us things that aren't necessarily what we believe. He shows, for example, that the effect of changing a class size doesn't have much impact. And it's uncomfortable for us because we know viscerally that if we have fewer students, we can concentrate on them better, and we think we can do a better job. But actually, he shows that the research doesn't work like that. The effect of class size is small. But of course, it says to us that if we're going to reduce our class size, we've got to change our practice as well. It's not just the effect of reducing the numbers, it's the nature of our interaction and how we use that interaction that we get some effects. He shows that if you want a negative effect, then allow the children to watch television all the time. If you want a negative effect, move the children around from group to group so they don't know what they're doing or the people that they're with. These are the negatives. But the real positives he pushes are anything really to do with early years education tends to give a real boost to students. The most important education we do is really from about the age of 0 to the age of 5. And any government that really wanted bangs for its buck would put the money in there rather than in the higher education end of the market. He shows us that if you have a student who's not learning, the best thing you can do is an early intervention with them to recover them quickly. There's no point building on weak foundations. So the more that you actually concentrate on a mastery learning approach, then actually the stronger the system will build. He shows, and this is really important, that there's a lot of personal effects in education which actually are much greater than the effects of the program. And by this he means that if you look at the impact of motivation on learning, you look at the impact of a self-concept on learning, you look at the impact of self-esteem on learning, then actually these factors are well above that 0.4 on the barometer. So actually, the more we do to help children to understand themselves, to feel some power in the world, to feel that education is about themselves, then actually those are the programs which, allied to the teaching that we put in them, the quality teaching, those are the ones which will have the big effect. This is just one of the bodies of work which we should know, we should be able to quote, we should be able to say to our great reformers and administrators, and sometimes people like me who come along and say, oh, our system needs this, we should say, where is it on Hattie's barometer? Because actually, why are you promoting something which has such a little effect, and why are you ignoring the things which have big effect? But it goes on through Michael Barber's work with McKinsey these days. Again, all of these things can be picked up off the web. He's done a lot of work to look at what makes school systems work worldwide, and he's guiding governments towards early years developments, much more focus on literacy and numeracy, because these things have mass effects. It's not great for everyone, but across a whole system, these things have effects. We ought to know the work of Martin Seligman. Martin Seligman is at the forefront of the positive psychology movement. And positive psychology really in the last 15 years, has brought in much more of a science to understanding the psychology of learners. And it's a positive psychology is an alternative, really, to traditional psychology. Traditional psychology tends to take as the problem, we have mentally ill people, we have people who are sad or depressed, how do we help them? Positive psychology flips it over and says, I'm not so much worried about that. I want to look at the 90% of people who are happy and what makes them happier. And where can we find out how to make sort of people who are competent, who are how can we help them to build the qualities which will make them successful in life? And Seligman, I'll say a little bit more about this, promotes the ideas of teaching things like self-esteem, self-concept, and resilience. And these are pieces now which we should be building into our schools, because sometimes actually rebuilding them, putting them back where we've let them go. One of the best things that actually Hattie and Seligman agree on is one of the best things we can do with students is to give them outdoor education challenges, personal challenges, because it's not only that they learn the sort of immediacy of that, they develop character and the talents to be able to overcome barriers which they encounter many times in their life. And so it goes on. Jonathan Haidt, Linda Darling-Hammond on professional development, Paul Black and Dillian Williams on assessment for learning. You know, assessment for learning, again, if you haven't spent time digging into it and digging into the importance of getting students to do their own assessment and seeing what happens to the class when actually you've got students offering that knowledge back to you. For me, it's the great revolution in pedagogy of the last 30 years. It's something we ought to know deeply, we ought to know the practices of. And so it goes on. And Charles Ledbetter, who's kind of led the way in recent years in unpacking what works in some of the emerging countries of this world, because education can't just be about somehow taking what's worked in America or Europe and reproducing it everywhere. Actually, some of the greatest ideas are those coming from emerging countries. Now, education in its prevalence, it's everywhere. How do we make sense of it? How do we make sense of where it's going? And this is really difficult because education is now everywhere. What form does it take? It could take, you know, for some of us, if we say education, we say school, we think elite private school. It could be in the US, could be in the UK. It's a sort of Eton and Harrow. We have this idea about what sort of education. In other places, it's the shiny new design of schools being built, maybe in Singapore or the Gulf, or it could be a school. You know, one of the schools I've had responsibility for, an 11,000 student school. Indian school, low-budget school in the UAE. It could be a mango tree. It could be a great website that one of our publishers who are sponsoring the event might have. It could be a well-used textbook that's been thumbed so many times. What is education? It could be an online tutor, and it could be, as Sugata has demonstrated, it can be a hole in the wall. How do we find out what's going to happen? And I want to go through here I want to go through about 9 trends. And they're a bundle of contradictions. It's not like we're going in one direction and so it's just a question of wake up, get on the train, and it'll all be okay. Actually, there's powerful forces in education happening, and it's taking us in many different directions. And it's absolutely true. I mean, I could talk in generalizations today about where international education's going, but I may well find out, if some of you have come from Japan, that the global trends I'm talking about might be swamped by changes in the birth rate, which are causing actually fewer students to go to school, schools to be closing, and it may feel anything like the global trends that I'm going to talk about. But you know, I'm going to do something of global, and you can think about how it impacts locally. The first 4 things that I want to look at are really to do with changes in the market of education. And this is all to do with finance, the economics of education. But it's very, very important. We see this. It will affect a great deal of what happens. What we're seeing worldwide at the moment is every politician, doesn't matter what colour, what part of the political spectrum they come from, They are pointing out education is crucial. And the ambition of every politician is to raise the performance of their country. We have these huge international studies now which allow those politicians to sit down fretfully with each other and say, they're doing better than me. How do I get to be as good as Finland or Singapore or Korea? And it's pushing up these expectations. It's good in many respects because it's making people think about how do we invest, how do we pay more attention. Although some people in different parts of the world are finding the attention of their governments slightly less pleasant than when they were ignored by them. But the interesting thing is this has come at the same time as, of course, governments have hit financial crisis. So we have governments wanting to raise their game, but they have less money. And at the same time, governments are dealing with communities which are desperate to get better and better education. There's nowhere in the world where a community is happy with what it's got. If it's a developing country, it wants more schools, it wants real schools. If it's an emerging country, it wants to go faster. If it's a developed country, it wants more quality more consistently. Everybody's looking for more, but governments are actually in less of a position than ever to respond. And what this is going to do, and it's already doing, is it's going to mean an absolute burgeoning of private education. Now, interestingly, as a sector, of course, EFL has always lived with a high proportion of private education. But what you're going to find is that the rest of the school system and the university system and the college is going to move towards private models. Not just in one big rush. It's not going to, education worldwide is dominated by governments. But actually, it's going to move at different pace in different places. But without question, it's moving from a government provision to more and more private provision. I'll just, if I put in private education into Google at the moment, the hits are 1.15 billion. It's already a big part of what people are thinking about within education. But if you look, and if you can see, it's not come out great on that diagram. In the world, it's very interesting that the place where private education is growing fastest is the Gulf. It's particularly true around Dubai, Abu Dhabi. It's starting to find its way into Qatar in big numbers. It's going to be a big part of what happens in Saudi. In fact, the government there is targeting 20% of its education to be private in form. And when you look at actually the demographics of the student expansion in Saudi, it's one of the fastest growing populations of 16 to 25-year-olds in the world. You realize that what's happening is that in this part of the world, from Turkey through North Africa into the Gulf, this Middle East is actually the crucible for new private education models in the world. People say that, of course, education is being formed increasingly on the Pacific Rim, or it's being formed by China and by India. But actually the growth of private education, both in China and India, is still very small. The number of people who will afford, at this stage, private education, even low-fee private education, is still small. And the real growth is in the Middle East. It's why I've been so interested to work here. And it's creating new models which we can study. You see it certainly in Turkey. You see it here in Istanbul. The growth of groups like DOA. DOA is probably the fastest growing private education body in the world. Go back just 2 or 3 years ago, it was round about 8 to 10 schools. It's now looking to go from round about 30 towards 80. In fact, I can't keep up with their ambitions on this. But it's a sign of private education coming, and it's a sign that actually this is the part of the world which is the crucible for it, and it's creating these new changes. So here we have this growing ambition for education, governments wanting more and more of it, but actually having to recognize that private education players are going to be a bigger part of it. And it's very interesting. Some governments are saying, fine, private side, get on with it, and they're letting it go. In other places, they're saying, oh, no, this is horrible. It's going to create inequality, it's going to create problems, you can't do it. Or some governments are saying, the last thing we're going to do is lose control of education because it's our way of maintaining our curriculum, etc. And these are just some of the classic contradictions, but be absolutely sure in the economics of this world, that what's happening is there is an increasing move to private education. And it's exactly the same as has happened in health and in other sectors. It's coming. People also say that, well, in private education, what's going to happen because economics is going to go this way or that way. We don't know where the economics is going to take us. And one reminder I always put up is 10 years ago, we were confidently predicting that digital content would become free because it would become ubiquitous, you'd be able to take it off the net. And actually, there was no future in publishing or in anything to do really with producing and selling digital content. As I said, I think it's very interesting that the sponsors of this conference are the publishers. They're clearly not having that bad a time. And actually, if you look at the graph of what's happened in digital content in the last 10 years, today, I understand, is the 10th anniversary of the launch of iTunes as a major content body beyond just music. And it's a really symbolic moment. What we're seeing is that people have developed markets, they've found ways to sell digital content, they've found economic tools, and it might be advertising, it might be subscription, but this is part of an explosion in our system. It's also the second big area that I wanted to pick out, is this is an age of teaching. I think worldwide, you could see the currency of the teacher growing in importance. And for a long time within national systems, there's been an ambiguity about teachers. They've often been in the sort of middle of the graduate employment, not paid really for the contribution that they make as well as they could. And they're working within government sector with perhaps a profession that's more safe and therefore moderately rewarded, rather than something which is really exciting and for the high flyers. That's changing. I think that now teaching as a profession is becoming a really exciting possibility. It is, you're actually in a position, we're in a position to say to young people, come into teaching, get a full qualification, and you'll be able to work anywhere in the world. You will be in a shortage. So increasingly, you will find that there will be people who are making bigger offers for your skills. And actually, it's becoming acceptable now to move from place to place and to use those skills. I mean, we have, again, if you look in the Gulf, which I've described as a crucible, you see that teachers are coming from other parts of the world. They're going into schools. They're being paid anything between 5% and 20% more than they might have if they were working in Western Europe or in the USA. They often are untaxed. They have good holidays. They get their accommodation. It's becoming a much better rewarded life. And people are catching on to it. And actually now, the possibilities of teaching are becoming richer and richer. We're going to get higher caliber people fighting to come in. Again, it's an exciting time. Part of the challenge for us will be to keep up with these people. It's going to bring problems. All of these things have contradictions. You know through the ELT community, really, there are good employers, and there are some that aren't so good. And a lot of people who've come out of the broader teaching community, who've been used to quite stable employment conditions, are going to now find there's a mixture of different employers. So actually, we've got to stick together and learn quite a lot about who we're working for fast. This is a time, the third trend is certainly a time when a great opportunity for enterprise. If I look around the world, I look at what people are doing with content, with services, with materials, with operators, the innovation is rich. But we're having to deal with the fact that actually communication is now so strong as well that somebody will copy what you're doing almost immediately. You only have to think about some of the fantastic maths games or English computer games that are available, the science material that's available, and actually by the time anybody's produced it, you could find someone else reproducing it in another part of the world for about half of the price. And I think there's a lot of adjustment. We've got to find these ways of taking advantage, enterprising advantage of education, but we've got to learn to move faster in the market as well. And there will be opportunities for the new world and the old. I could see many people who provide education services in the West getting very excited about the growth of English medium education and the possibilities that private are bringing. But on the other hand, as you look around the world, it's interesting how some of the very best solutions are coming from the emerging world. I was working recently in India, and came across two magnificent ventures in India. One of them is the Pratham charity, where actually the way that they are now getting a lot of the very poor children in India some access to early years education is they are producing materials from a charity, they're giving them out to women who work on the corner in a slum, in a poor area. They're just allowing these people to set up a little sort of just place where children might come and learn some literacy, some numeracy, some early social skills. They're giving them the material, they're paying them almost nothing because it's all for charity. And they're actually starting to make a big difference in those communities to those children's prospects, not unlike what Shigata's doing. But this is a charity, they're already reaching 21 million children through just the work and growth of this charity. I go as well down to the south of India, and there in Chennai you can come across companies which are broadcasting materials through satellite connections. They can't use the internet to get into the poorer areas of India because the schools don't have an internet connection. But they can use satellite and a cheap satellite dish, and they actually will run the lessons from Chennai in a radio studio or a video studio, and those will go out and be simultaneously broadcast into hundreds, if not thousands, of schools. And they have it two-way, so that the children can interact. You have one teacher in a studio talking to a screen. It's a bit like Khan Academy on steroids. It's this immense ability to be able to talk to many people. Very, very exciting times. The second just couple of contradictions fall under the heading of knowledge. We know that we're living in a time when the march of science is enormously exciting. We have, if you like, more to talk about and more to teach than ever. But we're living as well in this world where what Andy Warhol predicted, that everybody would be famous for 15 minutes. It will become a world of celebrity. Well, of course, he was wrong, because everybody's actually famous for about 15 seconds. It's a tweet, and then you're gone. But we live in an age when we have the Human Genome Project, we have more understanding of environment, of science, of biochemistry, of the operations of the brain. But yet our children get often distracted into really a dumbed-down knowledge. They get distracted into celebrity. And, of course, many of them are learning that the one thing you could do with knowledge is you could copy it from one place and put it in another place, and it seems to represent something that you know. These are our challenges as teachers, is to actually help them concentrate on the depth and not on the superficial. And it's why, for me, there will always be a great role for teachers. I mean, if you think about what Sugata Mitra did with his children, his kind of unique, and as he calls it himself, sort of silly proposition was to ask children to study DNA. But of course, that's exactly the kind of thing that good teachers do. They take challenges to kids. They don't just allow them to live within a closed and uninteresting space. At the same time, on knowledge, we know now that children have boundless creative opportunities. Where perhaps I grew up many years ago with the ability to write essays in text, and that was my opportunity, my medium for expressing my views and putting my arguments and organising my data and my ideas. The great thing about today is that children can be authors in text, in photo, in video, in audio. They can put these things together using digital tools, and they can be terrific authors in all of these media, and like Stephen and Jeremy, they can be mixed media in their presentations as well. But it's really funny that actually when we look around the world and we look at the march of technology, and we look at things like the introduction of tablets and mobiles, and everybody gets excited about the latest fashion in technology, very often the new devices don't contain those tools for authoring in video and photo. Often those come along later rather than straight away. And I see schools and I see governments that are rushing to buy tablets to give to students. And you look at the tablets and you realize that actually there's a better toolkit on the old technology than there is on the new. And I think we've got to keep our heads as we do this. It's also interesting in the world that if you look in the Gulf now, some of the private players who are starting to run educational models, they are now saying, actually, we're not going to buy the hardware for our kids, because a lot of the children are buying them at home. We'll buy them for those that need them, and we'll provide those targeted solutions for those in most need. But it's now actually much more a case in schools that we ought to get people to bring in their machines from home, work with their own devices, and we'll spend the money that we would have spent on hardware on two much more important things. One is knowledge management, and the other is curating, so that all the resources in our school are available to every teacher and to every child 24/7. And if we see this professionalization of knowledge in schools, I'll be far happier than if we see just a proliferation of new tablets and devices. The third group is very much looking at things through the eyes of students. And we've got to track and understand our students. It's always been a first rule of teaching that you should understand your community. You should know where your students are, where they come from, and you should look for ways to connect to that. Around the world, as you look at what's happening, you certainly see that young people want qualifications. They want to be helped to get on. But it's interesting that even in the pursuit of qualifications, that some things other than just teaching them directly, the sort of packaged knowledge, something other matters. There's a great example, for instance, in the States, where some of the most successful schools of the last few years in raising performance in the States have been the KIPP schools, the Knowledge in Power schools. They're some of the better charter schools. They've got a real energy going to raise achievement in different districts. They've done everything they possibly could to make achievement the goal of communities that traditionally perhaps have been low in motivation. And they've done everything. They've got better teachers in, they've got better organised, they've got better knowledge, they've got better content, and they've organised the schools brilliantly. Their results are certainly showing up all the way through the States in these schools as higher. Their progress has been faster in the last few years than any of the schools around them, just by concentrating on what works seriously. But it's very interesting because they've now, of course, they've got some of their students have gone 4 or 5 years on from school, and they've gone through college. And a couple of years ago, KIPP discovered that even though their students were doing much better by the age of about 17, 18, when you track them through college, only 1 in 5 of those children were actually succeeding and graduating from college. They'd done everything right in the school, except they'd not built in a factor of resilience. They'd not actually embedded in children something which allowed them to overcome setbacks. So when these children had hit difficulties as they'd gone to college, they didn't have the same set of tools at their disposal as some of the other kids who come from more prosperous backgrounds. And it's why around the world we're seeing increasing emphasis on things like outdoor education again, extracurricular clubs, things which personally challenge individuals to find their own way, to overcome something, to, even if it's live outside in a tent for a weekend, to go on some sort of expedition. It doesn't need to be to a different country, it doesn't need to be expensive, but something which makes them really take on and test themselves. And these qualities are showing up, so we need to balance always in our curricula this chase for qualifications and the need to build these personal qualities. We're also seeing around the world a lot of people advocating, today is a world of learning international values, of learning how to be an international citizen. Again, it's interesting. I work with lots of IB schools and other curriculum schools where they make this a big feature. But one thing I've certainly learned from the last 5 years of my traveling worldwide is that one of the most important things you do in teaching is to help children understand their own identity. I now design and build schools. The first building block of my design is the identity of the children. How will we run something in the schools where the children know who they are, where they come from? How will they know their histories? How will they know their stories? How will they know their art? How will they know who they are? And we find when we build these schools, if we don't build that in, if it's a single community or it's a very mixed community, if we don't build that into the curriculum from the start, then children, yes, sure, they get an international orientation, but we get huge disconnects We get disconnects between the kids and their parents. We get disconnects between the values of what they're learning and where they've come from, and they're unexplored. So it is one of these lovely contradictions. We've got to build into our future curriculum this international outlook, the ability to work on different continents with different cultures, to learn different languages. But we've also got to make sure that in everything we do, children are rooted in their own identity. And the last one I've got here of contradictions comes from some of the people who study really the development of the brain and development of really behavioral dynamics and the modern world compared to the old world. And people are pointing out that there's a new thing happening to our young people that we should be conscious of. Children are growing up faster. They are maturing physically at an earlier age. They can regularly reach puberty between ages of 8 to 12 now, where maybe 30, 40 years ago, that range would have been more, from 10 to 14. Children grow up quicker, and even if you think about the way they talk, they behave, the behavior they're trying to copy, you could see it in the behavior of 8-year-old, 9-year-old, 10-year-olds now. So children are growing up faster. But the fascinating thing is, actually, they're becoming adults, many of them, later. I know many cultures, many families, where actually the children don't really go out to become adults until, well, actually it might have been 17 when I was growing up. It's now 27. So we have a longer period where young people who are seeing the world through their eyes, they're neither child nor they're quite adult. And it's interesting, how are they using that time? Are they using that time to find out who they are? Are they using it as a time to learn as apprentices from their parents? Or are they disconnecting? Are they going somewhere where they're choosing comfortable things? Are they using it for an unimportant knowledge? I think we should be conscious that our role in schools is to take this time, precious time, and to use it to challenge children deeply, but also use it to connect them in their families, to their parents. I still think that one of the great successes of the really good schools in the world are that they talk to the parents as well as the child whenever they're learning, and we've got to find ways of reproducing that in the future. Finally, who will prosper in the future world? Well, many different kinds of people. And I decided that actually the best allegory for this was the people who will prosper come from the Avengers, from comic books. We will see in the new world Captain America still thriving. The big companies that, actually not just America, but also Western Europe, who are into education, have great content, have great services, they are still going to be around. They are still going to dictate a lot of what education looks like. They've got good systems, good content, good processes, and they will go on. The Black Widow will also succeed. That's, for me, the astute, the clever, the person who can understand locally what works and can keep very fleet of foot and can change things and make adaptations. They will. Thor will develop. Now, Thor is somebody for me like Shigata Mitra, who is a big figure who has a tremendous compassion for education and for the achievements of fellow man, and actually will drive educational change through that compassion. Spider-Man will do very well because Spider-Man knows everything about networks and how to build networks around individuals. And Hulk, well, Hulk for me is the great educational possibility that lies within countries like India, Indonesia, China, and the Middle East, that actually this big mass will do things in education which will excite everybody. And I hope there's even scope for the occasional silver surfer, like myself. But through their eyes, this is my final message, is that if children are asking us, students are asking us, even adult students are asking us, help me find things out, help me get on, help me make sense of the world, I think the question we should really keep focusing on is that question of how we help them make sense. In all we do, we must challenge our young people. We must expect the very best from them. We must demand that they study difficult texts, difficult stories, difficult issues, things which can't be solved. We must cause them to wrestle with problems, even when they don't have solutions. And we could cause them to feel their identity and understand where they come from. We should cause them to tackle the big questions of life, of faith, because we must encourage children and young people to understand, to make sense. One of the great revolutions I think we'll see in our schools in the next 10 years is the development of much more meditation, teaching children how to meditate and to be mindful so that they discover themselves. Because all of these things are what we understand are at the center of depth and quality in education. And actually, I've got to say, the young people know it as well. If you look at things through their eyes, what do they want most? They want to make sense of the world, and they want quality. That's the most important trend in education. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. That was a really inspiring speech. Well, before you go for your coffee break, we'd just like to remind you to take a look at the exhibition stands. Also, we'll be coming right back in here for J.J. Wilson's talk following the coffee break.